Welcome back to The End of Reason, where we delve into the most chilling stories in literature and film, whether it's horror, psychological thrillers, or true crime. I'm your host, C.R. Knight, and today we're revisiting one of the most iconic stories in both horror literature and film, Carrie. Stephen King's Carrie was his first published novel in 1974, and it quickly became a sensation. It's a brutal, poignant, and terrifying tale of a young girl's struggle for acceptance, her desperate need to belong, and the horror that comes when she's pushed too far. The novel gave birth to one of the most unforgettable characters in horror history, Carrie White. She's both a victim and a force of destruction, making her one of King's most tragic, yet terrifying figures. Today, we'll compare the original novel to two major film adaptations, the 1976 version directed by Brian De Palma and the 2013 remake directed by Kimberly Peirce. We'll dive into the characters, themes, and stylistic choices that make these adaptations stand out, and whether they do justice to the source material. We'll also explore how these adaptations reflect different periods in filmmaking and the social issues of the time. Plus, we'll be getting into the key differences in how each adaptation handles the pivotal prom scene, Carrie's relationships with her peers and her mother, and the handling of supernatural elements. So, get comfortable, and let's dive into the world of Carrie White, where teenage angst meets supernatural terror. An overview of the book Carrie is a deceptively simple story at first glance. It's about a shy, awkward teenage girl who's relentlessly bullied at school and severely abused at home by her fanatically religious mother. When Carrie gets her first period, she's publicly humiliated in the school locker room. This event triggers the development of her telekinetic powers, and as she begins to harness them, she also begins to stand up for herself. But the story takes a dark turn when she's the target of a cruel prank at prom, leading her to exact a bloody and catastrophic revenge. King uses an epistolary format in parts of the novel, mixing third-person narrative with news reports, scientific papers, and witness testimonies, creating a patchwork that gives us multiple perspectives on the events. This structure adds an element of inevitability. By the time we get to prom night, we know something terrible is going to happen. The novel reads like a true crime account, which adds a sense of realism and gravity to the horror. Turning Carrie into a movie was inevitable. It was King's breakthrough novel, and the story's themes of bullying, isolation, and revenge were ripe for adaptation. But adapting it was no easy task. The novel delves deeply into Carrie's internal world, and it relies on narrative devices like newspaper clippings and psychological reports, things that don't translate directly to the screen. Brian De Palma's 1976 adaptation is widely regarded as a classic. It's visually striking, with bold directorial choices that emphasize the emotional intensity of Carrie's transformation. De Palma turns King's intimate story of pain and revenge into a grand operatic tragedy. Fast forward to 2013, and we see a different take on Carrie. Directed by Kimberly Peirce, the remake modernizes the story, placing it in a digital age where bullying extends beyond the schoolyard and into cyberspace. This version attempts to explore new aspects of Carrie's journey, but as we'll discuss later, it's a more complicated adaptation. In King's novel, Carrie is more than just a tragic figure. She's a study in loneliness, repression, and fear. She's someone who has been emotionally and physically abused by her mother for years. Margaret White, Carrie's mother, is a religious fanatic who believes that her daughter's natural bodily functions are a manifestation of sin. This abusive upbringing leaves Carrie vulnerable and unable to cope with her feelings in a healthy way. King gives us deep insight into Carrie's internal world. We see her emotional transformation, from a girl who's terrified of the world to someone who finally realizes she has power, both figuratively and literally. Her telekinesis becomes a metaphor for her repressed rage, and as the story progresses, we see her grow more confident and aware of the power she wields. But it's a double-edged sword. Carrie's powers give her control, but they also push her further into isolation. King writes Carrie with a level of sympathy that's rare for villains in horror. She's someone you root for, even as she becomes increasingly dangerous. Sissy Spacek's portrayal of Carrie in the 1976 film is nothing short of iconic. Spacek captures Carrie's vulnerability and awkwardness perfectly. There's an ethereal quality to her performance. Carrie seems almost otherworldly in her innocence, which makes her eventual turn to violence all the more shocking. De Palma's film emphasizes Carrie's fragility. The camera lingers on her wide-eyed expressions and small movements, creating a sense of intimacy with the character. You feel her pain deeply because Spacek embodies Carrie's suffering so convincingly. But when the prom scene comes, Spacek's transformation is terrifying. The rage that's been simmering beneath the surface erupts, and Carrie becomes something monstrous, yet you can't help but feel sorry for her. De Palma uses slow motion, split screens and close-ups to build tension, and these techniques make Carrie's emotional journey even more intense. The prom massacre is filmed like a ballet of destruction, with Carrie at its center, orchestrating the chaos. Chloe Grace Moretz plays Carrie in the 2013 remake, and her interpretation is different from Spacek's in some significant ways. Moretz's Carrie is more conventionally attractive and less awkward, which led to some criticism that this version of the character didn't feel like the same outcast we saw in the novel or the original film. However, the remake tries to show a more gradual evolution of Carrie's powers. Early on, we see her practicing her telekinesis, gaining control over it. In some ways, this adds depth to her character. She's not just reacting to what's happening to her, she's actively learning to use her abilities. But at the same time, it takes away from the explosive, uncontrollable nature of her powers that was so effective in the original story. While the 2013 film modernizes Carrie's world with the inclusion of social media and cyberbullying, it doesn't quite capture the same emotional intensity as Spacek's portrayal. Moretz's Carrie feels more like a typical teenage girl with a supernatural twist, whereas Spacek's Carrie felt like a deeply damaged individual who was teetering on the edge of madness. Margaret White, Carrie's mother, is one of the most frightening characters in the novel, and it's not because she has any supernatural abilities. Her power comes from her religious fanaticism. Margaret is a strict fundamentalist who believes that anything related to sexuality is sinful, and she uses religion as a means of controlling Carrie. Margaret's cruelty is both physical and psychological, and she inflicts years of abuse on Carrie in the name of righteousness. King gives us glimpses into Margaret's backstory, showing how her own traumas and religious upbringing led her to become the woman she is. But what makes Margaret so terrifying is her unwavering belief that she's right, that everything she does to Carrie is justified. She's a symbol of the dangers of extremism and how it can warp a person's worldview. In the 1976 film, Piper Laurie plays Margaret White, and her performance is larger than life. Laurie's Margaret is terrifying in her intensity. She's not just a strict mother, she's a zealot who believes she's doing God's work by controlling Carrie. Laurie's performance borders on operatic, which adds to the surreal quality of the film. De Palma emphasizes the physical and emotional distance between Margaret and Carrie. The way Margaret looms over Carrie, the way she speaks in cryptic biblical language, it all creates an atmosphere of dread. When Margaret finally meets her end at Carrie's hands, it feels like a symbolic destruction of the religious oppression Carrie has suffered her whole life. Julianne Moore's portrayal of Margaret White in the 2013 remake takes a more restrained but equally chilling approach. Unlike Piper Laurie's grand, almost theatrical performance, Moore's Margaret is quieter and more insidious. Her religious fanaticism is still deeply ingrained, but she expresses it through muttered prayers and self-harm rather than wild-eyed sermons. This more subdued version of Margaret feels almost more terrifying in its realism. It's a quieter but more pervasive form of control over Carrie. Moore's Margaret feels like someone who could exist in real life, making her all the more unsettling. Both Laurie and Moore's performances are effective, but in very different ways. Laurie's Margaret is almost operatic in her intensity, while Moore's is more grounded and psychologically disturbing. Laurie's portrayal makes Margaret feel like a larger-than-life villain, while Moore's Margaret feels more tragic and desperate, clinging to her faith in a more quietly deranged manner. This difference reflects the tone of each film. De Palma's version is more stylized and exaggerated, while Pierce's remake tries for a more grounded, contemporary take on the story. At the core of Carrie is the theme of bullying, and King does not hold back in depicting the cruelty that Carrie experiences from her classmates. The novel's infamous opening scene, where Carrie gets her first period in the school shower and is mercilessly mocked by her classmates, sets the tone for the rest of the story. King doesn't just show the physical and verbal abuse Carrie endures, he also delves into the psychological effects of bullying. We get a sense of how deeply Carrie's isolation has affected her and how it has shaped her self-image. Carrie's experiences aren't just moments of cruelty, they're a lifetime of being told she's less than, which makes her eventual outburst all the more tragic. In De Palma's 1976 film, the bullying is depicted with just as much intensity, but it's heightened by De Palma's signature visual style. The shower scene, with its soft lighting and dreamlike quality, contrasts sharply with the viciousness of the bullying, making the scene even more jarring. The slow-motion shots of the girls throwing tampons and screaming at Carrie are almost surreal, giving the scene a nightmarish quality that sticks with the viewer. One of the strengths of the 1976 film is how it captures the group mentality of bullying. The girls' cruelty feels inevitable, as if they're feeding off each other's energy. This pack mentality is emphasized in the prom scene, where Carrie's humiliation is once again a group effort, orchestrated by Chris Hargensen and Billy Nolan. The film makes it clear that the bullying Carrie endures is systematic and unrelenting. The 2013 remake updates the bullying to reflect the digital age. In this version, the girls not only humiliate Carrie in the shower, they film it on their phones and upload the video online, turning Carrie's suffering into a viral spectacle. This addition is a smart modernization of the story, as it reflects the way bullying has evolved in the age of social media. Now, humiliation can follow you home, and the whole world can watch. While the remake's inclusion of cyberbullying is relevant, it also feels somewhat surface level. The film doesn't dive as deeply into the psychological toll this kind of harassment takes on Carrie. In contrast, King's novel and De Palma's film give us a more thorough exploration of Carrie's internal struggle. The 2013 film focuses more on the spectacle of the bullying rather than its emotional impact on Carrie, which lessens the overall effect. The prom scene is the climax of Carrie, and in the novel, King builds it up with a slow, deliberate pace. We know from the beginning that something terrible is going to happen, but King keeps us in suspense, allowing us to see the prom through Carrie's eyes as a moment of redemption, at least for a little while. Carrie has been invited to prom by Tommy Ross, the popular boy who genuinely wants to give her a good night. For a brief moment, Carrie believes that she might finally be accepted, that she might finally belong. But of course, this moment is shattered when Chris Hargensen and Billy Nolan execute their cruel prank. The infamous bucket of pig's blood is dumped on Carrie, and in that moment, all of her hope is destroyed. King's description of the prom massacre is chaotic and brutal. Carrie's telekinesis is unleashed in full force, and the gym becomes a war zone. King describes the horror with visceral detail, making the reader feel the full weight of Carrie's wrath. Brian De Palma's handling of the prom scene is one of the most famous moments in horror cinema. De Palma builds the tension masterfully, using slow motion and split-screen techniques to heighten the sense of impending doom. The audience knows something terrible is going to happen, but De Palma stretches out the moment before the blood is dumped, making it almost unbearable to watch. Sissy Spacek's performance in this scene is mesmerizing. When the blood falls, you can see the shift in her eyes. Carrie goes from elation to devastation in an instant, and it's heartbreaking. But once her powers are unleashed, the tone shifts dramatically. De Palma turns the prom into a visual spectacle, with Carrie's telekinesis tearing through the gym, lights flashing, students screaming, and fire engulfing the building. The split-screen effect allows us to see multiple angles of the destruction, making the chaos feel even more disorienting. The 1976 prom scene is iconic because of its operatic intensity. De Palma doesn't shy away from the horror of the situation, but he also captures the tragedy of it. Carrie's destruction is both terrifying and cathartic. She's been pushed to the brink, and now she's taking her revenge. The 2013 remake takes a different approach to the prom scene, using more modern visual effects to showcase Carrie's powers. Chloe Grace Moretz's Carrie is more controlled in this version. Her telekinesis is more precise, and she uses it with a sense of purpose. While the prom scene in the remake is still intense, it lacks the same emotional depth as the 1976 version. One of the biggest differences is the way the blood is handled. In the 1976 film, the blood is the catalyst for Carrie's breakdown, but in the 2013 remake, it's almost secondary to the telekinetic spectacle that follows. The remake focuses more on the destruction Carrie causes than on the emotional impact of the prank itself. That said, the remake does offer some visually impressive moments. Carrie's telekinesis is depicted with more advanced CGI, allowing her to control objects with a precision that wasn't possible in the 1976 film. However, this focus on visual effects comes at the expense of the emotional core of the scene. While the remake is exciting to watch, it doesn't pack the same punch as De Palma's more visceral, emotionally charged version. In Carrie, telekinesis isn't just a cool supernatural power, it's a metaphor for Carrie's repressed emotions, particularly her rage. King uses Carrie's telekinesis as a way to explore the idea of power. Both the power we hold within ourselves and the power that others have over us. For most of her life, Carrie has been powerless, both at home and at school. Her mother controls every aspect of her life, and her classmates torment her without consequence. But when Carrie discovers her telekinesis, she begins to take control of her life for the first time. It's no coincidence that Carrie's powers emerge at the same time she gets her first period. King is making a direct connection between Carrie's developing womanhood and her newfound power. Carrie's telekinesis is tied to her emotions, particularly her anger, and as the novel progresses, we see her gain more control over her powers as she becomes more confident. But this power comes at a cost. Carrie's anger, once unleashed, cannot be contained. In the 1976 film, De Palma emphasizes the destructive potential of Carrie's telekinesis. The prom scene is a visual representation of Carrie's bottled-up rage being unleashed on a world that has wronged her. The use of split screen during the prom massacre gives the viewer a sense of the chaos and destruction Carrie is causing, but it also shows how detached Carrie has become from the world around her. She's in control, but she's also lost in her own rage. The film uses Carrie's telekinesis to explore the idea of power as both a gift and a curse. Carrie's powers give her control over her life, but they also isolate her further. By the time she reaches prom night, Carrie's powers have become her only means of defense, and while they allow her to take revenge on those who hurt her, they also further alienate her from the rest of the world. The prom scene is visually stunning, but it's also tragic because Carrie's telekinesis, once a symbol of her awakening, has now consumed her entirely. She's no longer just a victim, she's a force of destruction, and there's no coming back from that. In the 2013 remake, Carrie's telekinesis is depicted with more precision and control. Chloe Grace Moretz's version of Carrie seems to have more agency over her powers, using them in a more calculated way during the prom scene. This contrasts with the more chaotic, emotional outburst in the original film, where Carrie's powers feel almost uncontrollable. The remake also plays up the spectacle of Carrie's powers, with CGI-enhanced sequences that show her controlling multiple objects at once. While this makes for some visually impressive scenes, it takes away some of the raw emotional impact that the original film had. In the remake, Carrie's telekinesis feels more like a tool she's wielding, rather than a manifestation of her internal rage and trauma. This shift in how Carrie's powers are portrayed changes the tone of the film. It becomes more about the physical destruction she can cause, rather than the emotional toll that her powers take on her. Religious extremism plays a central role in Carrie, and it's most prominently seen in the relationship between Carrie and her mother, Margaret White. King uses Margaret's fanatical religious beliefs as a means of exploring the theme of control. Margaret uses her twisted interpretation of Christianity to justify her abuse of Carrie. For Margaret, everything natural, particularly anything related to sexuality, is sinful, and she imposes these beliefs on Carrie from a young age. Margaret's religious extremism is portrayed as both terrifying and tragic. She genuinely believes that she's saving Carrie's soul, but in reality, she's destroying her daughter's ability to live a normal life. King uses religion as a metaphor for control, showing how it can be weaponized to manipulate and harm others. In the 1976 film, Piper Laurie's portrayal of Margaret White takes the religious extremism of the novel and amplifies it to an almost operatic level. Margaret is larger than life, and her religious fervor is depicted with an intensity that borders on the surreal. Laurie's Margaret is terrifying, not just because of her beliefs, but because of the absolute certainty with which she holds them. She believes that everything she does to Carrie, locking her in the closet, beating her, controlling every aspect of her life, is justified in the eyes of God. De Palma's use of religious imagery throughout the film reinforces this theme of control. Crosses, religious statues, and candles fill Margaret's home, turning it into a claustrophobic space where Carrie is trapped. The religious overtones in the film serve as a constant reminder of the oppressive force that Margaret represents in Carrie's life. In the 2013 remake, Julianne Moore's portrayal of Margaret White is more subdued, but no less disturbing. Moore's Margaret is quieter and more introspective than Laurie's, but her religious beliefs are still used as a means of controlling Carrie. Moore's Margaret engages in self-harm as a way of punishing herself for her sins, which adds another layer of psychological complexity to the character. The religious themes in the remake are still central to the story, but they're presented in a less exaggerated way than in the 1976 film. This makes Margaret's control over Carrie feel more realistic and insidious. It's less about grand religious declarations and more about the subtle, everyday ways that Margaret uses religion to control and manipulate her daughter. This more grounded portrayal of Margaret adds a layer of psychological horror to the film that's different from the more dramatic interpretation in the original. In King's novel, the ending of Carrie is both tragic and inevitable. After the prom massacre, Carrie returns home to confront her mother. The showdown between Carrie and Margaret is tense and emotional, with Margaret finally revealing that she believes Carrie was born of sin and that her powers are the work of the devil. In a fit of rage, Carrie uses her telekinesis to kill her mother, impaling her with kitchen utensils in a moment of raw emotional catharsis. But King doesn't give Carrie a happy ending. After killing her mother, Carrie's injuries and emotional exhaustion take their toll, and she dies in the street, cradled by Sue Snell, the only person who showed her any kindness. The novel ends with an epilogue that details the aftermath of the prom massacre, including investigations into Carrie's telekinetic abilities. The final note is one of sadness and loss. Carrie's powers were a source of both empowerment and destruction, and her story ends in tragedy. De Palma's 1976 film follows the book's ending fairly closely, with a few key differences. The confrontation between Carrie and Margaret is visually striking, with religious imagery dominating the scene. When Carrie kills her mother, De Palma frames Margaret's death in a way that mimics the crucifixion. Margaret is pinned to the wall with kitchen knives, her arms spread out like Jesus on the cross. This use of religious symbolism adds a layer of irony to Margaret's death, as she dies in the pose of the saviour she idolized. The final sequence of the film, however, is what truly sets it apart from the book. In the novel, Sue Snell's role in the aftermath is more subdued. But in the film, Sue has a vivid nightmare where she visits Carrie's grave and a bloody hand reaches out from the earth to grab her. This iconic jump scare has become one of the most memorable moments in horror cinema, and it leaves the audience with a lingering sense of dread. De Palma's decision to end the film on this nightmarish note reinforces the horror of Carrie's story, suggesting that her presence and the trauma she inflicted will never truly be gone. The 2013 remake also stays fairly true to the original novel's ending, but it makes some changes to the final confrontation between Carrie and Margaret. In this version, the confrontation is more drawn out, with Carrie using her powers to hold her mother in place before ultimately killing her. The death is more visceral and less symbolic than in De Palma's film, with fewer religious overtones. The remake's ending does offer one small change that shifts the tone slightly. After Carrie dies, the film includes a brief scene where Sue Snell is seen giving testimony in court about the events at prom, hinting at a legal investigation into Carrie's telekinetic abilities. This epilogue echoes the novel's use of reports and interviews, but it feels less impactful than the haunting epilogue in the book or the final jump scare in the 1976 film. Carrie was Stephen King's first published novel, and its success launched his career as one of the most famous and prolific authors in the world. The novel's themes of bullying, repression, and revenge struck a chord with readers in the 1970s, and it continues to resonate with audiences today. King's portrayal of Carrie as both a victim and a villain is what makes the story so compelling. She's someone who is deeply sympathetic, but also capable of terrifying destruction. The novel's use of telekinesis as a metaphor for power and rage has influenced countless other works of fiction, and Carrie remains one of King's most iconic and frequently adapted stories. Its exploration of the dark side of adolescence and the horrors of high school have made it a touchstone for anyone who has ever felt like an outsider. Brian De Palma's 1976 adaptation of Carrie is widely regarded as one of the greatest horror films of all time. The film's blend of psychological horror, supernatural elements, and striking visual style has made it a classic, and Sissy Spacek's performance as Carrie is still considered one of the best in the genre. The prom scene, in particular, has become one of the most iconic moments in horror cinema, with its blend of emotional intensity and visual spectacle. The film's influence can be seen in countless other horror films that explore similar themes of isolation, revenge, and the dark side of adolescence. De Palma's use of slow motion, split screens, and surreal imagery has also influenced generations of filmmakers. Carrie remains a touchstone for both horror fans and filmmakers, and its legacy continues to grow with each new generation. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into Carrie, don't forget to subscribe to the End of Reason podcast and leave a review. It really helps the show grow and keeps the spooky conversations going. Until next time, stay curious, stay spooky, and remember, sometimes the most terrifying horrors are the ones that lurk within.